This is Kamesh Pemaraju from Platform9. We welcome all of you to this webcast today, which is one of the series of webinars that we've been running for the past month, and look forward to seeing all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. So today's webcast is about networking in the world of containers. So we are excited to have great speakers and fantastic content today. As always, we'd love you to be interactive, ask questions along the way, use the chat window and the Q&A window as you feel appropriate, and we will try and answer them as we go along. And of course, we'll have a Q&A session towards the end. Peter, can we go to the next slide? Hello?
There you go.
All right, okay, I can still see it updating. There you go, now I can see it. All right, so today's webinar's agenda is roughly along these lines. We'll have the kickoff and introductions to the panelists. We have an exciting fireside chat set up for you in an informal kind of back-to-back conversation with two experts in the field that are out there implementing containerization technologies with a lot of enterprise customers. We will do a recap. As you know, this is a series about the journey to Kubernetes and how you get into production and all the different things you have to deal with as you get into that journey. So Peter Frey will kind of give us an update on that. We'll go into the fireside chat focused on networking today. And then towards the end, we will focus on Calico, which many of you may be familiar with. If not, we'll give you an introduction and kind of go into how you can use Platform9 with Calico in the end, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Can you switch to the next slide? So let's do as always, folks, we are doing a drawing, and many of you, as you get into the journey towards Kubernetes, you want to learn about Kubernetes in depth. So in that spirit, we have a partnership with Learn K8s, which you may be familiar with, and we're going to give away a free course at Learn K8s. So stay tuned. Towards the end of the webinar, we'll announce the winner from the lucky winner at the end of the webinar today. Next slide. So let's get through the speakers and the speakers for the session. Next slide. So we are again very fortunate and honored to have two experts in the field. Peter Frey, as always, is our constant companion here in this series. He's our chief technologist at Platform9, and he also heads up our solution engineering team, working very closely with our customers as they get into production with real world implementation, integrations with all of their complex infrastructure, whether that's a public cloud or on-prem or at the edge. He obviously brings a lot of experience with Kubernetes, and he's done a lot of cloud work over the years. And we're also excited to have today, obviously this is a co-webinar with our partners and friends over at Tigera. We have Nicola Kabar, who is also a very experienced architect and solutions builder for customers. He works with a lot of users and customers, brings a lot of technical leadership, lots of expertise for platform adoption. He was at Docker and Cisco, so clearly he brings a lot of credentials as far as networking goes. And Peter, as I said earlier, is going to go through a quick introduction to the journey into Kubernetes, and then we'll have a fireside chat between these two experts. And then Nicola will go into the details about, specifically about Calico and some of the networking considerations around that. Next slide. And then we have Chris Jones, our own product manager at Platform9, who runs our product management for our managed Kubernetes platform. He also brings a lot of experience, specifically in the application performance management space, but he brings a lot of experience with enterprise deployments, understanding hybrid cloud management. So he's going to give us a quick tour de force of the platform and Calico, and why managed experiences, what the management experience looks like. So we're all excited to have this session today, and thanks again for joining our webcast. At this point, I think I'm going to hand it over to Peter, who is going to do a quick introduction and get into the fireside chat. And as always, please ask questions as we go along, and I'll moderate the session as we go along. Thank you very much, and Peter, over to you.
Great, thanks, Kamesh. As Kamesh mentioned, my name is Peter Frey. I'm Field CTO here at Platform9 Systems, and part of the reason for having this webinar series is I talk to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people in different organizations and different verticals around the country and around the world, and it seems that none of them, or all of them, I should say, are on the journey to Kubernetes in production. And so we decided that we'd put together this webinar series that kind of addresses some of the common challenges in the adoption of Kubernetes as you're going down that path. So that journey usually begins with an enterprise architect. It could be a developer. It could be somebody in the office of the CTO. It could be the CTO himself. Large organizations, small organizations. They're all starting to think about what does Kubernetes mean? What does it mean to my organization, and how are we going to adopt it, right? And so this, excuse me, this journey is a journey that I've seen happen over and over and over again. And these people make decisions from day one. They maybe Google, how do I deploy Kubernetes? How do I want to do it on cloud? Do I, in the clouds, AWS or other? Do I want to do it on-prem and local VMs? Right, and then once they do that, then they're like, okay, well, how do I want to deploy it? And they make some decisions there, and then it comes to networking, CNI. Specifically, what CNI plugin do I want to adopt? And they make a decision. The first decision isn't always right. There are many CNIs out there, and we'll get into that more in a little bit. And then as they're moving through the adoption, they get up their first Kubernetes cluster. They deploy their first application. It's the hello world of Kubernetes. Maybe that's an Nginx ingress or Nginx deployment, or maybe it's actually the Kubernetes hello world, but they deploy something and they're pretty excited. As they move on, they typically move into a more complex application. Things like WordPress is a good example. That was my first more quote unquote more complex application where, it's got MySQL, it's got, MySQL requires persistent storage. How do I do persistent storage in Kubernetes? And that brings up a whole nother set of Googling and research and things that we need to address. Then, these enterprises, well, we've got WordPress, we've got our first Kubernetes clusters. Developers are starting to think about it. We'll take one of our apps and containerize it and move it into Kubernetes. And then after they start doing that, they start thinking about what's next, right? Well, if I'm running Kubernetes in production, how am I going to do monitoring? And then they Google some of that in the Datadog or Prometheus and Grafana, right? And then they make a decision, and then they deploy something, right? And then, well, if it's in production, logging is done completely different in the Kubernetes space. So how do we do that? And they Google around and they find there's low-key in the EFK or ELK stack, and they pick one and they deploy it. And they have to research each one of these things. And this Kubernetes cluster is getting more and more components, more and more pods, more and more capabilities inside of it. And then, as they continue down that, right, they want to deploy their application, not just run it in Kubernetes, but they want to explore how I can do continuous integration and continuous delivery. So they Google a little bit of that, maybe Jenkins X, maybe a Spinnaker. Maybe they're looking at things like leveraging their own CI/CD system. Maybe they'll connect GitOps. Lots of ways of doing different things. They usually pick one. It's probably something that they've got in-house, and they deploy that. And then they start thinking about, well, do I want to do A/B deployments or not? And then the conversation turns to Istio or Linkerd or things along those lines. This is a very complex, and in our enterprise, our customer here that's going down this journey that I'm giving an example of, they're starting to realize that a Kubernetes is not just Kubernetes, it's an ecosystem. They make a lot of decisions, they do things differently across the board. And by the time they get to this A/B deployment, a lot of the people I talk to just want the app running. They're not too concerned about A/B deployment. So they'll skip this because they realize how complex Linkerd or Istio can be, right? From there, then information security gets involved. How do you do identity management? Do you want to use DEX? Is there a PCI data? Do we have red and green zones? Data in flight and data in rest? Is it encrypted? They start answering those questions. After that, they're starting to think, yeah, we're feeling pretty good. Let's get this app rolling. And then they start thinking about day two operations. Our SRE team started get involved. You know, Kubernetes upgrades, how do we do that? Do I have to upgrade underlying components as well? What happens if I upgrade and etcd loses quorum? Things along those lines. So day two is very, very important for everybody considering that. And then, you know, production outages, you know, if that happens, you know, that's when you start realizing how complex it is to debug and run a Kubernetes cluster in production. Anyway, so here's a brief shameless plug for Platform9, right? We offer a simple, fast Kubernetes deployment, out-of-the-box monitoring, out-of-the-box logging, out-of-the-box container storage, CNI options, and CI/CD examples that you can deploy, right? We've got a world-class support team. It is a managed service, so we support everything that we deploy and we guarantee it with an SLA. Okay, so that's enough on that, but
Peter,
you know, yeah.
We're already getting some interesting questions. Do you want to take a question now, or do you want to wait until the end?
Let's wait till the end, or at least maybe a couple minutes.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so the series that we've got put together, we did the intro in September. We're starting with the networking layer now. We're going to talk about Calico and, you know, CNI, what the Calico plugin is and does and how it works and some of the interesting things that come along with that. Then we're going to continue with another one of our partners with a telco 5G edge use case. And we're going to talk about, you know, other CNIs, Multis, Calico, Mac VLAN, SRIOV, DPDK, and how that supports the 5G world. Then, you know, we're going to talk more about storage, you know, and with our partner Portworx, right? And how do you implement a CSI layer inside of a Kubernetes cluster to support your stateful pods and things like that. After that, we'll do some logging. You know, so the idea is everything along the steps along the way to getting that journey, we're going to outline through our series here. From there, you know, we have DevOps and data pipelines, so CI/CD, maintaining Kubernetes, right? The last one's going to be around best practices. We're going to bring everybody, all of our partners, in a panel discussion, and really, you know, let our attendees ask questions about what's happening. Okay. So let's move on. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the chat. One of our co-presenters, Nico, has joined, and he's from Tigera, the creators of Calico. And we're going to talk about some of the ramifications and how to deploy and what does it take to get Calico up and running in a production type environment. So I'm gonna kick this off with one quick slide here. And what I thought I'd do is, you know, I wanted to introduce the Container Network Interface, or CNI, right? And what is it? So a CNI is a CNCF project, right? It defines a specification and libraries to configure networking interfaces in containers. I didn't say Kubernetes, but containers running Kubernetes, so it applies there. A CNI is responsible for connecting pod networks, as well as doing IPAM, IP address management. It defines a way of creating it creates a network namespace for every container that's out there, right? It identifies the networks that the container must attach to. It's executed at container creation and when it's deleted. And the goal here is that any container runtime should be able to run with any network plugin. And we're going to be focusing on the Kubernetes world. And so this concept of selecting a CNI plugin is a requirement to run Kubernetes. And there are many different kinds, right? I mentioned a few before: Flannel, Calico, SRIOV, Multis, DPTK. You know, and our customers and you are going to be deciding what kind of networking interface do I want to deploy and how do I want to use it. So selecting the right CNI, you know, allows enabling network security. Specifically, Kubernetes networks policies, right? Security, pod-to-pod traffic, encryption, and more. Kubernetes network policies, are applied to namespace and scope to namespaces, applied using pod labels. Kubernetes policies rules can specify traffic that is allowed to move from and to pods or namespaces. The Kubernetes policy rules also can specify protocols, TCP, UDP, etc. The key point here is that Kubernetes doesn't enforce network policy. It's the CNI. Okay, so again, selecting that CNI is going to be important as you're moving through the adoption of Kubernetes. And as you can see here, there are many Kubernetes components. A Kubernetes service, that's an abstraction of a group of pods, right, represented by a virtual IP. So it's using the CNI. Kubernetes DNS, right? The fact that every pod in a Kubernetes cluster is discoverable via a name. So all good stuff here. Kubernetes ingress controllers operate at layer 5 and above, right? It's a load balancer, and it's going to help push traffic. Actually, it'll allow termination of SSL endpoints and things like that, and it will push traffic to the backend services and the backend pods that are ultimately supporting that. So from here, Nico and I are going to talk about some of the best practices in adoption of the Calico CNI. Nico, did you want to jump in at this point?
Yeah. Thank you, Peter, and thank you for having me. It's a great partnership that we're building together with the Platform9 team. So as you kind of mentioned, there's a lot of networking, especially Kubernetes networking, is definitely one of those topics that can be very, very challenging for many adopters out there, enterprises, as kind of intricacies of dealing with even existing kind of networking and overlays, and the complexity even when you mix things, when you mix kind of the hybrid cloud networking model, and now kind of the yet another layer of Kubernetes, and the demand that microservice-based architectures and the move to microservice-based architecture puts on the performance and reliability of the network is tremendous at this point. So that's why we're in working with a lot of customers today, we're seeing there's a heavy emphasis on designing something that's going to be future-proof, that's going to be forward-looking, that integrates existing technologies and existing kind of workloads, but also is something that kind of opens up the door and opportunity for onboarding the next generation of applications, and doing so in a robust and reliable way. So this is going to be like a good interactive way to kind of look into some of the questions that we typically have to kind of work with our customers to address with, in the design phase. As you mentioned, there's plenty of options out there for Kubernetes distributions, for platforms. There's also a lot of options for CNIs. And once you pick that, the CNI, there's also a lot of design considerations to have and think about, and that requires, understanding what is needed, what are the hard requirements, what are the soft requirements for the design phase, and how those get translated into the technology stack that you're adopting there. So some of those questions that we have here definitely can be applied to other CNIs, but I'll put them in the context of Calico. So the first thing that many users or enterprise customers are deciding on is like, how do we make sure that when we're picking the pod sizer, right? How do we pick one? How do we make sure that it's going to be something that is future-proof? how big it should be. So there's a lot of factors, and I'll walk through each of those questions, and happy to kind of answer your questions as well here in the panel, as well as in the chat. It's really important before we even talk about the pod side to talk about the second question, which is the data plane itself. And the reason why we do that is it's depending on where you're running Kubernetes on edge, data center, public cloud, within your environment in a managed way. It's important to understand how integrated it needs to be with your existing network. For many enterprises, it is crucial for Kubernetes as a platform to be tightly integrated with their existing network. For others, actually, the networking teams have decided that Kubernetes as a platform, Kubernetes workloads can be kind of secluded in the sense that they can do whatever they want, right? Pick whichever data plane they want, and because everything is going to be locally significant to that Kubernetes cluster. So if there is a hard requirement for what we call an underlay connectivity or underlay integration, where pod IPs are going to be routable within your network, within your VPC, or if you're running cloud, then the pod side is going to be dependent on your IP address management and availability for siders, and for many enterprises, V4 is still scarce, so there can't be, they're very limited in how big those siders can be. So that's really important for any users starting their journey, because the thing is that I want to really highlight, when it comes to some of the CNI design considerations, it's very crucial to get it to do the proper design and ask those type of questions beforehand, because it's very difficult. It's nearly impossible to switch things up after the fact. Unlike in an application deployed in Kubernetes, if things don't work, you can roll a new version and things are great. But when it comes to networking, it's such a critical piece where, although feasible, it is very difficult to either switch CNIs or switch pod sizes, especially if you're doing it in place. So the pod size range needs to be something that is going to be depending on how many nodes you have in the cluster, how many pods are you going to permit on each node. I think the default in Kubernetes is 110, or if you're going to get to that number, then there's an easy math number of nodes times 110. You're going to, of course, give yourself some leeway and give yourself a side that is going to be providing that number of IPs to your pods. Now, the second question here is, how do I choose a service side, and what data planes or services we choose. Just wanted to kind of highlight that Calico, although it does provide three key functionalities. One is, as a CNI, it provides the pod networking, so basically wiring, the layer 3 networking between pods, providing layer 3 connectivity between pods. The second functionality is IP address management, and the third one is network security. All three of them can be independently basically turned on. You can use Calico in networking only mode, networking in IPAM mode, networking and network security mode, or just only network security mode. And we can dig deeper into that, but the reason why I mentioned that those three things are critical is because service side and service networking and translating service IPs to pod IPs, and even assigning service IPs is not the functionality. It's not the responsibility of any CNI. The Kubernetes itself, the Kube API server, is responsible for actually handling everything related to services, because they're an abstracted layer, right? And they're independent of the CNI itself. At the end of the day, when pods need to communicate between each other, or pods need to communicate to the service, the service VIP gets translated, the cluster IP gets translated to a set of pod IPs supporting its backend, and then the CNI is responsible for pod-to-pod connectivity, pod-to-pod networking. Pod to service translation is something that the Coup API service takes care of, and kube-proxy basically does the work on each of the nodes. So when it comes to service-side, it is something that also dependent and can be dependent on if you want to expose those services internally within your environment. So example of that would be if, I work with some customers who are actually peering into the network, peering to their VPC, and they're advertising the service side as any other IP in their environment. Therefore, they're using DNS service and mapping them to service IPs, and any external service that wants to connect to a service running on Kubernetes can actually use the service IP because it's routable. If that's the case, we hit the same either limitation or restrictions around how large the service side that needs to be, because it is dependent on the availability of sides within the network. If we say that the platforms are not routable, they're not, or the Kubernetes platform are not routable, they're locally, they're not integrated into the network, then you can pick and choose any slider. Really, it can be a class A if you want for either the pod or service slider, because really just you're using some type of encapsulation is going to be locally significant to that cluster. And I've seen also, and it is not a bad idea to use the same service slider across different clusters, assuming, because the traffic is not going to leave the cluster, that translation is not going to leave the cluster, so you can reuse the same service slider across different clusters. If we go to the next question, which is around network encapsulation, it is also related to the previous questions. So Calico specifically, when it first started, it was basically a pure layer 3, no encapsulation option, and it evolved to support both VXLAN and IP and IP encapsulation. So how you pick and choose it also dependent on many factors, right? Let's name some of them. So if there is a hard requirement to integrate into the network, it's actually more performant and easier to work with, easier to configure, and easier to observe things when you're actually peering into the network. So I would say close to maybe 40, 50, if not more, percent of the customers I deal with have chosen that path because it's really a native layer 3 approach. Pods get IPs that are routable. There's BGP peering that is happening from every node in Kubernetes to a top of rack or a VPC router or a route reflector, and therefore there's BGP is used to route prefixes and pod addresses across the network here. From a networking perspective, and that you can use existing tooling, existing troubleshooting methods, because there's no encapsulation. The IP addresses ranges are something that you're familiar with. The processes are something that you're familiar with. So that's one approach.
Nico,
yeah.
Nico, I'm thinking about this, and I'm wondering, if some of our attendees are just beginning to deploy Kubernetes clusters, and they're going down the path of they've selected Calico, but I think then they have to make a decision kind of right away. And that first decision is, are my pods going to sit on the network directly, or are we going to encapsulate that traffic? So as I'm starting to think about that, if it's an encapsulated environment, clearly I can put any network pod sider or services sider inside of there because of encapsulation. But if I'm going to do it on, so the decision is BGP, Calico and BGP mode, or Calico and IP mode, right? So if, why would somebody choose one versus the other? Is it performance reasons? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So so basically the three options are, the two options are encapsulated, unencapsulated. Unencapsulated, we have one option, basically it's native, chooses BGP, and that is, the advantage there would be native tooling, native integration, performance. There's no encapsulation, there's no overhead to doing that. So those are the, I would say, key things that are make this option, appealing.
Does
Sorry.
that mean that I have to have BGP running in my local network to be able to advertise these
Correct.
pods?
Yes, you have to have BGP or deploy, or we can help you deploy BGP, and then you can use route reflectors and whatnot to connect to other routing protocols that you have within your environment. A lot of customers deal with already have BGP running even at the top of rack. That's a common pattern that we've seen over the past 8-10 years. So a lot of them are already there. So yeah, that's definitely an accurate answer there, Peter.
And if you use BGP mode, does that bypass kube-proxy and go straight to the pods? Because the pods are
no, that's not the case. So kube-proxy only comes in place when you're talking about a pod to service. So what we're talking about here is if you want to reach the pod from other services outside of Kubernetes, or the pod reaching other services outside of Kubernetes. So north-south traffic, basically, or even east-west traffic between pods. That is a data plane decision. Or data plane layer here. The kube-proxy is always going to be in place because if you're trying to do east-west between pods and services, this is where the service translation happens, and translating a service VIP, a cluster IP, to the correspondent backend pods is the responsibility of the kube-proxy. Kube-proxy and the networking data plane, encapsulation are mutually exclusive, parts of the stack, right? So one provides the plumbing to go from pod to pod, or pod to external to pod, and the other basically is the abstraction layer translation of the IP to the backend, and doing some of the load balancing to load balance the traffic from the pod to the service and the backend pods in the background.
Great.
I know it can be confusing a bit. I totally understand that, but it's unfortunately that's kind of it's part of the Kubernetes stack. There's some confusion there, but one of the best thing about it is if you launch a Platform9 instance and work with Calico, it's really easy to get that on that. Everything is already set up for you. Just doing a time check. Sorry. What?
Yeah, real quick. I just wanted to ask if one of our attendees is looking to deploy a Kubernetes cluster and they don't know if BGP is deployed, then that makes for test and dev kind of clusters a simple decision. Because you can deploy Calico in IP and IP mode. All pod traffic's encapsulated, and that would have no impact on the network.
Yeah, so that's a great segue here. So the two other options are encapsulated IP/IP or VXLAN. The default mode, if you just use Calico, is IP and IP. I believe that's the case with Platform9's choice. And the reason why we do that because that leaves zero dependency on the environment itself. Everything is going to be encapsulated, and things are going to be working outside, out of the box with no dependency on if you have BGP or you want to integrate it into your environment. So to finalize the kind of the discussion around encapsulation, there is definitely there's definitely value in doing encapsulation. As I said, if you don't have BGP running in your environment, if you don't want to deal with that, if you want things that easy and work out of the box, then encapsulation mode is a preferred method. And then you have to option VXLAN and IP and IP. Another good criteria here, like if you're running it in Kubernetes on Azure, for example, Azure networking does not support IP and IP, so therefore you pretty much are you basically have only the VXLAN option to use this. So there's some pros and cons to each of the encapsulation mode, but overall, all three modes provide connectivity. It just depends on your design requirements and where you're running. This is how you can decide which one is best for you. Okay. I think that should be
Nico?
Yep.
There are a couple of relevant questions that I think would be good for you to address at this point.
Sure.
One of them has to do with the CNI decisions that you alluded to earlier. And the question is, it's true that these CNI decisions are crucial. However, is it impossible to change the CNI after install, as you said? Does it require a total restart of all the CNI pods and workload pods if the CIDRs are different? Is it doable or not? I mean, that's the question.
It is doable. Yeah, it is doable. I've seen a couple of instances. I'll give the short answer here because it is doable. We've seen that the robotics is not a straightforward approach, and it is something that's going to require, of course, your some type of a migration of applications to be redeployed using the new CNI. It's going to be dependent on where you're running it, which CNI you're migrating from, which CNI you're migrating to, and it's not a. I would say avoid at all costs because it's not something that is I would do in production.
Well, let me take a different spin on that. You know, with platforms like Platform9, the ability to easily deploy Kubernetes clusters, even Kubernetes clusters as code. You know, I'm finding a lot of our customers, rather than going through the work of re-architecting and then redoing all of the pods and services in the CNI layer in there, it's much easier to treat these Kubernetes clusters as cattle and simply redeploy a new cluster and then deploy the apps back over there.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
Good point.
Yeah.
Just one more quick one. There's a question about root reflector, and the question is, how do we select the number of root reflectors? I believe that's the question.
It's a good point. So just for attendees who are not familiar with the concept of route reflectors, when you have a when you're doing unencapsulated mode, you can peer with you're doing a full mesh. Basically, every node is talking to every node in the cluster, actually with both IP and IP and encapsulated or unencapsulated. So as the number of nodes in your cluster grows, therefore the number of BGP sessions grows, exponentially, and therefore there's more chatter, basically, and more what's the right word for it? There is more BGP network traffic that's going to put more load, more CPU to keep up with those sessions for every node. So it's better to actually choose something like a route reflector, where you're only peering with not every other node in the cluster, where you're peering with a route reflector, hence the name. Typically, we recommend doing it in highly available mode, either 2 or 4. It really depends on the number of nodes. But I would say, as a recommendation, once you hit, if your number of nodes in your cluster is then less than like 80 to 100, I would say less than 100, route reflectors are not going to be like, they're not as needed. If you grow more than that, route reflectors are a must. I would say in our deployments today, we deploy 2, and you can, it's I think a replica set, so you can increase it to 3 or 4 as a highly available service.
All right, thanks, Nico. So if we could get through the remaining sections here in 5-10 minutes, we can get to Chris.
Yeah. Absolutely. Let me go through it. So, I mean, there's a reason why Platform9 and others have chosen Calico to be the default CNI, not only from a, not only for the functionality of the networking, but also network security. So, just a couple of things: why users and why platforms have been adopting Calico. It is, pretty fast in terms of its speed to deliver the networking layer. Native Linux data plane performance. As I mentioned, there's layer 3 networks. Out of the box, you have option to do non-encapsulation or encapsulation as you need. It is massively scalable due to the fact that we use BGP under the hood, and BGP is a protocol that basically powers the internet. Therefore, it is massively scalable. Really, the scale limit of your environment are the scale limits of Kubernetes itself. So as a number of pods or nodes increase, there should not be a limit that the networking is adding to it. Industry standardization, pretty much all the public clouds and their managed Kubernetes service have adopted Calico, either in networking mode or in network policy enforcement mode, which is kind of the other mode. There are other also platforms out there that have deployed it, and we're happy and enlightened by Platform9's decision to use and our partnership to use Calico out of the box and make it easier for their users to, have something this performant out of the box. Of course, we've seen more than actually close to 160,000 known clusters out there using Calico today, powering over 1 million nodes that we are aware of, and some of the largest financial services and SaaS companies and healthcare companies are using Calico right now. Next slide, please. I think I kind of talked about this, but here are some of the, in terms of just a proof to the attendees here that some of the largest customers have chosen not only Calico, but also we have an enterprise solution called Calico Enterprise that can run also on Platform9, providing additional layer of enterprise features and functionalities that go beyond what the open source provides around network security, automation, role-based access control, kind of UI, troubleshooting and visibility, compliance reporting, and so forth. So if you have some of those advanced use cases, especially if you're running on Platform9, feel free to kind of reach out. We'll have some information towards the end. If you have any questions about those, also feel free to ask them in the Q&A. Next question, please, or the next slide, sorry. I think we talked about some of those points already, so I'll skip those points that we talked about. But if you, because Platform9 makes it easier to provision and manage your cluster out of the box on various clouds or on-prem, bare metal, and with Calico, you already have that power, and this is all open source. So some of the reasons why out of the box you gain those just by using Platform9 with Calico, we have a simple, easy to use tool called Calico Cuddle. Similar to kube-proxy, it interacts with the control plane, so you can manage all things related to networking, understand IP address management, how many IPs are left, define network policies, manage network policies, all things that are there are available in Calico Cuddle. We talked about the various networking options, so I'm not going to repeat myself there. Peering options, we talked also, we discussed that if you want to peer with your VPC routers or on-prem top of rack, there's multiple peering options, making it extremely simple and extremely native in terms of how to deal with pod networking with Kubernetes. If you're coming from a networking background, it's very straightforward. One thing we did not really touch on, and I think it's one of the biggest value adds of using Calico, really proven network policy enforcement. There, if you're familiar, as I think Chris mentioned earlier, Kubernetes itself does not enforce network policies, and out of the box, every pod in your environment can talk to every pod in your environment. So there needs to be a different mechanism, and that is a network policy enforcement, or how to secure your applications all the way from layer 3 to layer 7. In Calico does that, whether you're doing it at the global level with all pods or applications, or very specific namespaces in either ingress or egress direction. Support for kube-proxy modes. I don't want to go through the details, but there's different modes on how you can work with kube-proxy, IPVS, or IP tables. And I want to highlight the data plane options that we're using. I mean, the standards have been IP tables, but there's probably a lot of fuss right now. There's a lot of excitement happening around Ebpf, which is kind of the forward-thinking newer mode to the data plane that is available in more recent kernels. That is something that we went with GA in the last release, providing a lot of really cool and exciting functionalities, higher performance, lower CPU and memory overhead, as well as, of course, our support for Windows host networking. So if you're looking for a CNI that's going to support Linux and Windows workloads, pretty much Calico is the only option out there in the market. And we have recently open sourced the Windows support for with Calico, so you can always use it for free as well. Next slide. I don't think I'm going to be able to go through the next two. I think you walked through them, Peter, earlier. So I think we have 15 minutes if you want to go to the next slide.
I think we should maybe jump to the Chris's session potentially.
Yeah.
If you quickly wrap up your session, Nico.
Absolutely. Can you go back one, please? I know I'm speaking pretty fast here, but if you're with the topic of kind of having this online resources and trainings, If you go to Tigera.io events, there's, we're doing a lot of trainings. They're free, twice a week. So feel free to go there and sign up, covering a whole lot of topics, around network security and so forth. So feel free to kind of jump in there and register for those topics. And if you go to the next slide, if you ever want to try,
Yeah.
you just got too excited. You wanted to register for one of them. If you go to the next slide, please. If you have also Calico Enterprise, we have a trial version that you can get. It's a hosted version, so you can go and walk through some labs and get the sense of how to create policies and manage policies at scale for enterprise use cases. With that, Peter.
All right, back to Chris at this point. Chris, are you there?
Excellent. I am. Good discussion, guys. I'll try to be brief, as I feel both Peter and Nico have really sort of touched on some of the items that I'm about to discuss. If we move to the next slide. As Nico was touching on, there's a number of reasons that make Calico a really good selection as a CNI. From Platform9 as a managed provider of Kubernetes, as someone that takes ownership and operates your clusters where you want them with an SLA, we want to make sure that our team can help. And we also want to make sure that our users have a good selection and have the ability to get started quickly, have the ability to customize their clusters, be it they're using them for test, dev, production, whether they're running in the cloud or running on premises. And we've looked at Weave, we've looked at Flannel, Canal, as well as Calico. And one of our customers came to us and sort of said, look, we're getting hit by the performance overhead of encapsulation. We would really like to leverage BGP. What do you think? Our CTO, took some time, went back to them, and we looked at how we run our Kubernetes control plane as well, and our application, which is the SaaS management plane that is Platform9. And BGP was an option to really improve performance by removing encapsulation and allowing, direct networking, as Nico was touching on. So that was the piece that really got us, I guess, interested and invested in Calico. And then, as Nico was touching on, security policies is a big benefit of running with Calico. As you mentioned, it can be something you can run as a standalone feature set. From a Platform9 perspective, this is something that is just always on when Calico is deployed when you're building a cluster. The BGP peering and setting up route reflectors and being able to configure the cluster networking to enable like direct pod networking is also a great benefit and a great addition. And you do see a significant reduction when running without IP and IP encapsulation. In terms of getting to one CNI, from our perspective, we have a lot of users that do choose to use Flannel just from a simplicity perspective. Moving forward, we'll be bringing in Calico's VXLAN capabilities, so people can then choose to start with VXLAN mode on Calico if that's the more simple method to get going, and then be able to leverage security policies there as well. And as I touched on, the multi-cloud support is a really big value driver from our perspective. We want people to be able to run Kubernetes clusters where you want to run them, not be trapped and isolated within one cloud environment. And Calico really does provide us the way to do that. We move to the next slide. What we're bringing with Calico and what we bring as Platform9 to, be it managed OpenStack or managed Kubernetes, is 24/7 support and a 3 nines SLA, not just for our SaaS platform that's running your clouds, but your clouds, right? Be it virtualization, be it Kubernetes, and that extends down into Calico as a managed software-defined network. So if you're getting started with us and onboarding as an enterprise customer, our solutions architecture team that Peter runs is going to make sure that the way that cluster is built and the way your network stack is designed is right for your business. And when something goes wrong, our support teams are going to be there to help fix that, recover from that outage, because we're managing your clusters, we're managing your cloud, right? This isn't saying you can have Calico, here you go, you're off by yourself. We're going to help you manage Calico. And to make that easier, we also have a way to interact with Calico via our Platform9 API, which means you can manage Calico remotely more easily without having to VPN and use Calico CTL, which is still supported and a valid way of interacting with Calico as well. So it's not just the CNI we're bringing.
There's a quick question, Chris. I think that's relevant to what you're talking about. You mentioned BGP and IP encapsulation. The question is BGP used in control plane even when IP and IP encapsulation is used for part-to-part traffic?
Yes.
Okay, the answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, there's actually some really great write-ups that we can probably share out. I probably should have included it in this presentation that talks about the Calico setup. Tigera has some really great initial trainings that I would encourage everyone here that's interested to get into and look at. I personally found them incredibly valuable as well in working on product design and UX of this. With this, I might share my screen and just sort of show everyone, I guess, how easy it is to get this up and running. And then we can go to questions. So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. So this is the Platform9 SaaS management plane. As you can see, I'm on the infrastructure page, and there are a number of clusters that I have running in my environment. I always like to keep one in here that's broken, so we can say it's disconnected remote states. This is a single node cluster I have running in our managed OpenStack. You can see it's running Flannel. Got a cluster running on top of VMware that's a multi-master cluster with MetalLB enabled that we also manage, and it's running Calico. So how do we go about setting that up? Simply, if you're doing it in AWS, you just attach the cloud provider by coming to cloud providers and adding a new cloud provider. That would then use your AWS account to build a cluster. If we're doing it using VMs or physical servers, what we call bare OS, you just need to onboard those nodes. And the way to do that is clicking Add Cluster, choose bare OS here and click Deploy. This first step will tell you how to connect nodes. So you can go through, download our CLI and connect it to the control plane. Once those nodes are connected, you'll see them appearing down the bottom here. So you can see that I've got 3 nodes that are already attached, and I'm just going to quickly go through building a cluster. So I've got 3 nodes. The next step is how do I want to set these up and who's the master? So I'm just going to do a single master for simplicity. I'm going to turn on privileged containers. I'm going to go next. I'm going to choose my 2 worker nodes, go next. Landing on configure network is where we can come in and turn on Calico. By default, we turn on IP and IP encapsulation. This will generally work in most environments. If you want to turn that off, once the cluster gets set up, you can then use Calico CTL and go through and configure all of the BGP peering that needs to be set up. If you want this to be a single node cluster that can be expanded, you can provide a virtual IP address for the cluster. Make sure that's reserved in your network range. Associate that with a given network interface on the host, and you'll be able to expand that cluster from 1 to 3 or 5 nodes. You can also container and services CIDR. Just be aware, one of the important settings here is block size. Block size for Calico will limit how many pods can run per node. So once you've got these settings, and as you can see, I'm leaving these blank because I just want a single node cluster, and that's the way it's going to stay. Default cluster settings for Calico as well. I'm just going to click next. I can enable etcd backup. I can deploy our managed monitoring stack, which has Prometheus, Alert Manager, and Grafana. Click next. I'm on the finish and review step. Click complete. That's going to go execute our API, talk to those nodes, and it's going to go and build out a single node cluster. This node health page is going to sit there and show you the process as everything builds out over time. So I can leave that on in the background and we can watch it build and sort of, I guess, open up to questions.
Thanks, Chris. I think there were a lot of questions that we answered along the way, but there's one in particular that seems to be coming up quite a bit. I guess this question is for you, Nico. The question is around what are the specific differentiators of Calico and what's special about it versus the other CNIs? Just maybe 2 or 3 top differentiators might be helpful for people to know.
Yeah, I think I kind of went through that, but I would say the simplicity around the architectures, right? Of it's highly distributed. There isn't a single point of failure, both from a control plane as well as data plane, using native etcd for a storage, basically data storage backend. Blazing fast in terms of performance. There's been a couple of articles as recent as I think 3 weeks ago, comparing the CNI from a performance perspective with and without policies, and using various data plane options like IP tables and Ebpf, and giving us an edge in terms of performance and the breadth of the security controls that are available as part of the Calico network policies that extend way beyond what even Kubernetes network policies provide. And finally, of course, how we wrap it up all with the enterprise version, so you can actually have a support behind it. It's not something that's going to be, it's not just one of those cool little buzzy projects in cloud native where they're going to be ditched. There's a company with SLAs, with support that is behind. It's not just a CNI, it's beyond that, I think. So I think those are the 4 key things to remember when looking at Calico, and what differentiates us as a CNI and beyond.
Thanks, Nico. A couple of other questions with a common theme. I guess it has to do with distributed multi-cluster deployments. Maybe Peter, you can take this one. So if you have multiple clusters running in public cloud and maybe partly running in the data center, is there a best way of cross-cluster communication or having a way of supporting these with a single networking fabric, I guess is the general theme of the question.
That's a great question. I think it's one of those it depends kind of scenarios. If you've got multiple Kubernetes clusters running in a common network and you have pods and services available at the network layer, for example, a Calico interface running in BGP mode and your pods are directly there, there's no reason that they can't communicate directly across layer 3 to those other pods in the other Kubernetes clusters. Nico, did you want to add anything to that thought?
No, I mean, it's I think you're spot on. Especially with like multi-cluster, there's definitely more consideration. I would say when using on Encap mode, it makes it a lot simpler because really there's no difference between the workloads that are running on cluster 1 can reach cluster 2 natively. I think I didn't really point that out earlier, without any further configuration, right? Because you assume there's reachability between the two clusters or even clouds, and it just basically those pods become just yet another type of workload with a routable IP.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. I think we're almost at time here, and we've answered most of the questions. Let me quickly go through. There was one question I guess was answered, but let's take this one real quick. 1 minute to answer this. How much? So, I mean, people can usually deploy Kubernetes in various configurations on bare metal or in a managed offering. So the selection of the networking, how much of that is dependent on the type of deployment that you do? Peter, can you probably take this?
Sure. I'm just looking for the question here. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
So what are the options if Kubernetes is running on bare metal versus managed? Is there a difference? I mean, if you use Calico in one or the other?
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So
I can help with that as well. So, Chris,
Go for it. I mean, I have an answer, but why don't you jump in?
yeah, I mean, for managed, I mean, for the selection of the CNI is kind of there's definitely additional consideration. If you mean by managed here by managed cloud Kubernetes services, then there's definitely a difference, because with the managed cloud Kubernetes services, then there needs to be a combination to provide the native networking with the VPC itself, like with AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. But the policy is something that Calico can help with. So the networking piece is something that's done by the respective cloud or managed cloud service, while the policy is something that's done by Calico itself. Yeah. I think for bare metal, I would say self-managed Kubernetes, there isn't really a whole lot different between bare metal or virtualized.
Yeah. So Platform9 supports deploying Calico in AWS and on bare metal. So you can deploy it in either BGP mode or IP and IP in both environments. Both of those have considerations at the networking level that you want to make sure that you're thinking about, especially with that pods and service insiders and things along those lines.
All right, folks, I think we're out of time here. Great questions. Really appreciate all the time from the presenters. I do want to quickly announce the winner, the lucky winner for the drawing. It's the name is Aditya Radha. It looks like I don't see him on the list here, but he's our lucky winner for the Learn K8s free session, free training session. He's a senior manager of tech operations at AppDynamics. Congratulations, Aditya. You'll soon see a note from us with your free offer there. I'd love to thank the presenters again. Thank you so much for coming, and appreciate the time. I hope you found this session useful. Take care and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.